I'm Scott.
I'm Bill.
And we're the Trade Guys.
You're listening to The Trade Guys, a podcast produced by CSIS where we talk about trade in terms that everyone can understand. I'm H. Andrew Schwartz, and I'm here with Scott Miller and Bill Reinsch, the CSIS Trade Guys.
Coming up next on The Trade Guys, we'll talk Trump poll numbers on trade. We'll talk about export controls and preferential treatment, all on the next episode of The Trade Guys. Trade Guys, we're back. It's Tariff Man's world, and we're just living in it, right?
No doubt.
We're rolling in it, yes.
No doubt. But I want to talk about some of Tariff Man's poll numbers, which, aren't very good. And, last time I checked, he does care about polls. But let me just read you some of this. Americans are generally dissatisfied with Trump's tariff hikes. An Economist YouGov survey of U.S. adults taken April 5th through 8th found 50% disapprove of his handling of foreign trade, while 39% approve. April 3 to 7 Quinnipiac poll of registered voters found a minus 16 net approval rating on Trump's handling of trade. I could go on. The news is grim for Tariff Man and his cohort, but it doesn't seem to bother him. Scott, what do you make of this?
Well, I think for me, the context of this is, first, he's not facing the voters again, at least not for the office of president. He's in his second term, and he has the mandate that he thinks he has. And he's been thinking about doing exactly what he's rolled out for about 40 years. So that's part one. Part two is there may be some wisdom in the tactic of disruption, only because if you look at the context of the last, so let's call it 15 to 20 years since the global financial crisis, there's been so little on the trade front that actually got done. In other words, this is just a blob that tends to have loads of inertia associated with it. It's very hard to move any of this. It's hard to start a negotiation. It's hard to get anybody to get down to brass tacks and really bargain. And so the status quo tends to persist over a long period of time, or it has, at least in current days. One of the possible tactical advantages of this kind of disruption is it wakes people up and it gets people back involved. So you have a president who's, while he is sensitive to poll ratings like any public official might be, he has some insulation from it. He has a lot of confidence in his approach, but I think the tactics may or may not work. It could be destructive. Don't get me wrong. But I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that there may be a benefit versus just trying to get your trade negotiators to work a little harder and get nothing, which is where we've been.
Well, Scott and Bill, if you ask President Trump's advisor, his outside advisor now, former White House advisor Steve Bannon, he is going to be president for a third term. So, there's that.
Oh, man. Straight voltage on the Trade Guys. Come on.
Bill, over to you. I know you've got a rant coming.
Well, no, I was just going to comment on the poll numbers. I think for a long time, this has been a case of cognitive dissonance on the part of a lot of the American people, in this meaning that they are entirely capable and quite comfortable with holding conflicting views at the same time and not noticing or not caring. So tariffs are unpopular. Actually, trade agreements are popular. Trade is popular. It goes up and down, but is generally between 55 and 70% support both trade agreements and trade. Andrew read poll numbers on tariffs, which are negative. But if you dig down deeper into that, there's a lot of data that suggests the American people think that will trade cost jobs? Yes. Will it raise prices? No. Will tariff raise prices? Yes. Will it hollow out our manufacturing base or make us more dependent on foreigners? Yes, it will. So in a sense, it's actually, I think, fairly smart of the American people to have this kind of split opinion, because in fact, that's what happens. It has cost jobs, but it also keeps prices low and it produces good things. And they sort of understand that. I think the problem that Trump will face right now, which is the problem of processing change. He's proposing big changes in the economy that's going to force a lot of people to do things differently than the way they've done it before. And, that may end up being better, or it may end up being worse. I'm kind of in the worst category, but the answer is always, we'll see how it goes. But I think for a lot of the American people, they don't say it this way, but they tend to say change is good as long as it happens to somebody else. And I just want to keep on doing what I'm doing. And what Trump is coming in is saying basically, well, you can't do that anymore. Your cup of coffee from Starbucks is going to be more expensive. Bananas are going to be more expensive. You're not going to be able to buy the toys you want to get anymore for Christmas because they would have come from China and now they're not going to get shipped anymore. That's the untold story, by the way, here. It's not just going to be price increases. It's going to be shortages. Retailers are already canceling shipments or boatloads of stuff that was supposed to come here. And it won't be coming here. Now, I don't think, we're not talking about food or necessities, but, I think when it comes time to back to school shopping this summer, I think consumers are going to face less choice. And will they notice? Maybe they will, maybe they won't, but they'll have less choice and it'll cost more. So, there are going to be downsides to that. Will there be toy manufacturers springing up in the United States to compensate for that? I think probably not. That's low-end manufacturing where labor costs are an important element of the cost of production. And we're not a low-cost manufacturer. Plus, when you're talking about manufacturing, you're talking about 8% of our jobs. We're doing all this for 8% of our jobs. We are 75% services economy. And he's not talking about that at all.
No, we never hear services. And, one thing I didn't point out about his poll numbers is, those are the numbers on trade and the economy, but his overall numbers are upside down from when he took office. He's minus 10 about from where he was on Inauguration Day. So that's not particularly good for him either.
Look, he's a polarizing figure. He's always had high negatives. This is one of the most predictable things about polling with Donald Trump is his very high negatives. And he seems to have lived with that. And I think he cares less now than he did maybe in the campaign, but that's part of that package.
Well, there's also a basic misunderstanding of tariffs by the American people. Another poll showed that 32% of respondents to Reuters poll incorrectly stated that tariffs are taxes paid by the country exporting the goods, when, as the trade guys know, the reality is tariffs are paid by U.S. importers to the U.S. government.
Yeah, I think what we really need is a case study here. And Bill, I suggest we have trade guys action figures produced wherever there's a trade deal and see what it takes to get them to the market.
Well, we talked about this before, Scott. We were going to have trade guys bobbleheads.
Yeah.
And I said, there's the American version for $5.99 and there's a Chinese version for 99 cents.
There you go.
We'll see who buys which ones.
There you go. Well, our numbers are huge, by the way. With all of Tariff Man's actions, there's a lot of interest in trade. In fact, I even got an email, or no, it was a text this morning from my cousin Kim, who wanted to talk about our recent discussion about cars. And, to add on to the car situation, my Audi dealers in a panic, they sent me an email this morning saying, hey, come get a car quick before they're all gone and you have to pay tariffs. So there's some panic out there amongst the dealers too.
This is where you get into the complexities of trade and the inertia associated with why things are made where and when that decision was made. If you look at, actually our friends in South Carolina are getting a lot of trouble from one of the White House advisors. This would be BMW, which runs a very impressive facility in Spartanburg, South Carolina, one of the most sophisticated manufacturing facilities in America. And it's a terrific plant. It's an international company. They're here. Well, I think they got here because of the tariff on SUVs and light trucks, that 25% tariff. And then they stayed for the talent of labor and actually lower production costs, lower total costs than Germany. So there's lots of reasons for them to be here. That's a good thing for the United States. It's a good thing for BMW as a company. And this happens all over the place. But their whole supply chain has a political risk factor involved. And almost everyone has to deal with that. Everybody's got a sole source supplier of some component or some ingredient that it's maybe made under patent and it won't be licensed. So those kinds of things will happen repeatedly. And that's going to create product shortages. It's going to create a lot of disruption in the market, and consumers will eventually see that.
The Spartanburg case is a very interesting one. Peter Navarro is the one that's been attacking them, although Trump did this once too, apparently on the grounds that a lot of their parts and components are German. And he was sort of saying they just assemble here. That's really not true. They don't just assemble here. They actually punch and shape metal here and do a lot of things here. And a lot of the metal they shape is American steel and aluminum. And they're also, interesting factoid that I did not know, they are now the biggest car exporter from the United States.
As a facility, single facility.
Single facility, yes.
Single facility in South Carolina in Spartanburg, which has created countless jobs around the plant. You got to have restaurants, you got to have suppliers, you got to have, all kinds of things around that. And we've talked about this, a lot on the Trade Guys.
I think it's north of 40,000 if you take the big picture of what they've done to the economy. This is exactly what I think Trump wants, yet it's being criticized, which just baffles me. Audi is an interesting case. It's an illustration of how this is not one size fits all, and how even within the same sector, you're going to get variations. I think Audi is one of those companies that doesn't have a lot of options as to where they can go and what they can do. A lot of the car companies, both Asian and European, like BMW, have facilities here, and they have some flexibility. They can import more or fewer cars. They can import more or less parts. They can make more here. They can make different things here. Audi doesn't have quite that much flexibility. And so when they say, you need to buy it now or you lose, they're onto something as far as Audi is concerned. That's not true for every model.
I don't think they're just trying to get a spring rush here. I think they're not kidding. Along these same lines, guys, I was in Germany, as you know, a couple of weeks ago. I was in Wiesbaden, to be specific, which is a very wealthy town outside of Frankfurt. And I saw a lot of Fords. I saw a lot of Ford SUVs.
Yes. And of course, Henry Ford built a plant in England in, I think, 1920 or 21. So Ford has been well established in Europe for now over a century. General Motors, likewise, has major investments in Germany. They don't show up as Chevrolets, but the companies participate in those markets. In other places, there's not been a major U.S. manufacturer who wants to contest the Japanese market at the moment, almost without respect to what the tariffs might be, mostly because it's a declining population and the vehicles demanded by consumers there are very different than the ones demanded in the U.S., given the size of the roads and the cost of parking and all these kinds of things. So there's a lot of factors that go into what makes for a good business proposition in a new market. Tariffs may be the least of a manufacturer's considerations as they go through that.
This is an example of how Trump really hasn't changed with the times. 35 years ago, in the mid-'80s, this issue was very different.
Mm-hmm.
American auto companies complained endlessly about their inability to sell in Japan. And they were right. They were not able to sell in Japan, and there were a bunch of barriers that made it very difficult. And a lot of politicians took up the cause then, and the Japanese response was effectively to move production here, which had the effect over time of defusing the politics of it. It created lots of communities, many of them in Ohio, that benefited from Japanese production. And the issue has changed over time. And I think the current situation is closer to what Scott said, that if Ford and GM were to try to sell in Japan, even if there were no barriers, they'd have some difficulty meeting consumer demand at the moment for it. And consumer demand is, I think, with a shrinking population, it's not a healthy projection for the long term. So the times have changed. The issues have changed. Trump is not.
I mean, you said it. And it sort of seems like, we're just going to have to ride this one out. I want to talk about something else. Let's talk about export controls. How is China's export control regime evolving? This is something, Bill, you have spent a lot of time on.
Well, they have a system which on paper is very much like ours. I mean, they're all sort of the same when you think about it. It's authority for the government to tell companies that you can't export without a license, and then to specify those things where you have to get a license, and those things where you don't. The Chinese initially didn't use this very much, but now they've discovered that it's a fairly effective weapon because there's a growing number of areas where they are technologically advanced, and in some areas ahead of us. I mean, Americans hate to admit that, but the reality is that, they've got good engineers and they produce, in some sectors, high quality products. There's more sectors where they're behind, but some where they're not. And what they're very good at is figuring out where they have leverage in terms of how to counteract what the United States does. And they're usually usually, not always, but they usually wait for the United States to make the first move, which in Trump always happens. And then they start to exercise their muscle. So in addition to matching us on tariffs, they've now tightened their export controls on some additional critical minerals. They've added 28 more companies to their list of unreliable parties. We have a similar list. As I said, they sort of match our system. Actually, they've added 17 to the unreliable list and 28 companies to the export control list. And on the critical minerals, which I love to go down the list here because even though I can't pronounce all the names.
You don't remember them from science class? And
I don't remember them because they are samarium, gadolinium, terbium, dysprosium, these sound like diseases, lutetium, scandium, and yttrium.
Oh, I love yttrium.
That and terbium are the only two that I've heard of.
That I had a bad case of terbium, and I missed almost a week of work.
My problem has been dysprosium myself, but
Yeah.
this is added to antimony or antimony, depending on your choice of pronunciation, gallium, germanium, tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, molybdenum, and indium. And then graphite should be on that list somewhere, but somehow it didn't make this particular memo. That's a lot of minerals, and I think the CSIS take on most of them, although we haven't looked at this latest list of 7, that was just a couple of days ago, but most of them, this is an inconvenience, but it's not necessarily fatal. Most of these things actually exist elsewhere. Where there's a Chinese monopoly, it's on refining and processing, not simply on the existence of the stuff. But once again, remember when we talked about companies locating here and about the time gap. The tariffs go on in the short run. If the factory is going to move here under Trumpian pressure, that's some years down the road. It's the same with minerals. The cutoff is now identifying other sources of supply and building other processing facilities in the United States is years down the road.
Well, it's way years down the road. And last time I checked, we're like 95% dependent on China, despite the fact that this stuff is available elsewhere.
For some of them, that's right. I think
Yes.
One of the more difficult ones is graphite, although you can make synthetic graphite. And although I don't think we do very much right now, it can be done. But again, ramping up to do that takes time and it takes investment.
Yeah.
We haven't talked much about that here, but if you're going to build a plant process or a plant to make synthetic something, you need to have some confidence that the economics of that are going to continue to exist into the future. Nobody is going to build a plant to deal with a problem that may go away in 2 or 3 years.
Not when it takes as long as it does to construct a plant or to get permits for extracting materials.
So how are we going to deal with this? How is the United States going to deal with this, guys?
Well, not very well, I think. One way to deal with it is a good alternative source for a lot of these things, not all of them, but a lot of them, is Canada.
Mm-hmm.
And if we had been busy mining, no pun intended, a better relationship with Canada, we could be solving this problem more easily in the short run. But we've managed to annoy Canada and then offend them through our tariff policies. I don't know the extent to which they're going to be disposed to be very helpful to us if we come back and say, we really need your minerals. I mean, the Trumpian approach is, let's bludgeon them into submission and get them to give us their stuff. And I just don't think that works all the time.
I would put Canada into the we don't want to help the United States category at the moment.
Well, look, both Canada and the United States are blessed with a large share of the Earth's crust. And so, and the U.S. Geological Survey has done magnificent work in the U.S. about where minerals are. And there's nothing magical about this. There's nothing really high tech about the process. But it is an act of will. It does take time and massive investment. And Bill's absolutely right. You don't invest because you have a temporary disruption. Because this is a going concern in the mining business is a 30-year projection. Okay. This is the instability is caused by policy and not expected to last long enough to factor into the economics on a positive basis. So it's a mess, in other words.
So you get time gaps again.
Yeah.
The costs go into effect immediately. The benefits, if there are any, are well down the road.
Guys, Let's move on. Let's talk about preferential treatment. Treasury Secretary Bessent says that 70 countries have called in to negotiate. Is this simply too many to handle? I mean, it seems like a lot of one-to-one negotiations over a bunch of things that could be settled in bulk here. I mean, that's a lot of countries to negotiate with.
I have a theory about that. Being a former bureaucrat, they may rise to the occasion for several reasons. First of all, the early signs are they're going to divide up the workload.
Mm-hmm.
So, Bessent will do some, Greer's will do some, Lutnick will probably do some. So that will make it a little bit easier. I think the other part of it to keep in mind is that the lengthy part of U.S. negotiations or normal trade negotiations revolves discussion internally over what are we going to offer them? Because as we've discussed before, trade negotiations are designed to be win-win. In order to get something, we have to give something. And so half the negotiation is to figure out what we want them to give us. The other half is figuring out what we're willing to give them. And this time around, there's not going to be so much of the second part, because the Trump plan is that everybody's going to come here and offer concessions. And what we're going to give is to not raise the tariffs. It doesn't require an extensive interagency meeting to decide that that's our concession. Now, you can argue, and this may evolve into more of a give and take. But if it doesn't, and it's just a question of, are they offering enough? And all the United States needs to do is say yes or no. And if the answer is no, here's what else we want. That'll save time, because it means the United States doesn't have to spend a lot of internal time figuring out what it wants to give up, which has been a significant part of past negotiations. The third thing they'll do is prioritize. There's a queue, and the big countries, mostly Asian, Japan, Korea, I think Vietnam, Australia will be at the head of the queue, and other countries will wait. And since they've got 90 days, I think what you'll see happening is you'll see boilerplate developing. The first 3 or 4, they'll make some deals. The concessions will be made and agreed to. And other countries will see, well, the Koreans did that. Let's just use that language because we're okay with that. And that'll make it simpler.
Yeah, I think Bill's right. Look, in fact, he just named the 4 economies that Secretary Bessent named. South Korea, Australia, Vietnam, and Japan. Now, of the 3 developed countries, 2 of them have a free trade agreement with the United States. So I don't know what we're going to bargain with South Korea and Australia, but that'll set a pattern. But I think the more interesting case study will be Japan, because first of all, Japan dealt with President Trump in his first term, came to an agreement, and lots of smiles around the table in the photo op, and we've kind of all forgotten about it by this point. But that was spun as a good deal. They know how to do that. They understand the guy pretty well, and they're a net importer of hydrocarbons. So, but you can buy a lot of natural gas or coal or other hydrocarbons from the U.S. and balance your trade pretty quickly. So I want to watch the Japan deal, and I agree with Bill that I think Vietnam is going to be the first less developed country to close with the U.S. And then you've set a pattern.
Scott, does Bill strike you as unusually calm about all of this right now?
Bill has been very reflective and quite relaxed on the program, and I'm a little worried about him, to be honest.
Yeah,
it's a total turnaround.
Bill, I thought you were bringing the heat today, and you're saying, hey, these guys can actually handle the negotiations.
In this particular case, yes. I mean, you haven't asked me whether it's a good idea or not.
That's true.
I think they.
Is it?
Well, I'm a former. Is it a good idea?
Yeah.
No, the whole thing's ridiculous. But
okay, there we go. All right, order has been restored.
All is well in the universe.
The universe is back functioning again.
Yeah.
If you want to rant, stay tuned for my column next week, because it's going to be about. Actually, it's a learning experience, because it's going to be about higher education. But it's going to be, as most of our listeners who are all trade nerds know, higher education in the United States is a services export.
Huge export of ours.
And we were about to give that one away. And so there'll be a rant about that.
Our colleges and universities are not going to be too happy about that. I mean, Bill, you teach at University of Maryland. It's got more international at this point than almost any university in the country, I believe.
And a lot of revenue that comes along with it because it's full. They pay full freight.
Right.
And this is not a new thing. I was at 2001, actually, or 2002. I participated in a conference post 9/11. And for those of you that remember the United States halted a lot of student visas in the wake of 9/11.
Sure.
It didn't stick, but for a year, there was a lot of problems getting in here. And you had to, if you were a student, you had to go to a personal interview. You had to go to the embassy. And it was a big pain. And a lot of students didn't get their visas in time for the next September matriculation. But I went to a conference once, and I was one of the speakers. One of the other speakers was the president of MIT. And he said that back then, this was a disaster because so many of their students, particularly their engineering students, were foreign students, and they paid full tuition. And to deny them entry was a major economic problem for the universities. Now, in the short run, Trump is probably going to do that to Harvard just to get even. But it's not about Harvard. It's about the state of our higher education. But it's also about our services exports, which is the one area where we have a surplus.
All right, guys, I want to finish up today with the sector-specific exemptions. This, of course, is ostensibly going to make sure that our electronics don't double or more in price. What about this? Why do you think they blinked on this one?
That's mostly about what consumers would see immediately and the fact that there's no decent alternative for electronics in the current supply chains.
Yeah, nobody wants to pay $2,500 for an iPhone.
Right. And so they're able to cope with reality. There are many ways that trade agreements wind up accommodating those kinds of interests. There are things like short supply petitions and other ways that producers, when they're missing an ingredient or something like that, can get relief. And Bill saw this coming a couple of weeks ago and indicated that this would likely be a part of what they're doing. They're a little broader. The sectoral exemptions are a little broader than I expected. But this is all part of taking the pressure off the vessel so it doesn't explode.
But it's also a sign of, I guess, the capricious way they're making policy. So Friday night, they roll out the exceptions in a customs notice, not a big announcement. And then Sunday morning, I guess Secretary Lutnick is on one of the shows, if not several of them, saying, well, this is only temporary. We've initiated a Section 232 investigation into semiconductors and downstream products. So we'll get you. We just won't get you this weekend. We'll get you down the road. I mean, to the extent there's good news in that statement, it's probably going to be a 25% tariff. Although today's gossip is that you heard it here first, and this is unreliable, but why not pass it on? It's a podcast. We're not being held accountable, I hope.
Why would we be held accountable?
There are two investigations going on. There's a Section 301 one that Biden conducted and concluded and never made a decision on, which was about China and its unfair trade practices on semiconductors. And then there's the Section 231 one, which has just begun, which is on the whole world and whether semiconductor imports are a security threat. So potentially that could produce two different decisions and two different remedies, or not, but one possibility is that. And one current rumor is that there will be two different remedies, but they'll both be the same. They'll both be 25% tariffs. But for China, they'll be added together, so 50%. Whereas for the rest of the world, it'll only be 25 because the 301 only affects China. The 232 will probably affect more countries than China. But regardless, that's better than 145.
Well, yeah, so stick around, tip your waiters and waitresses, and wait for the next announcement.
Yes, there will be one.
Yes, and so I think this would lead Andrew's Audi dealer to more beat the tariff sales. So we'll be seeing a lot of craziness here.
Here we go. All right, guys. As always, important discussion. We will continue. We'll be back next week. Really appreciate your insight.
Thanks.
To our listeners, If you have a question for the Trade Guys, write us at tradeguys@csis.org. That's tradeguys@csis.org. We'll read some of your emails and have the Trade Guys react to it. You've been listening to The Trade Guys, a CSIS podcast.